It's the year 536. You wake up and the sun doesn't rise. Not really. There's a kind of gray half-light. Enough to see by, not enough to cast a shadow. It'll stay like this for the next 18 months. A Byzantine historian living through it wrote that the sun gave no more light than the moon. Contemporaries across 3 continents described the same thing on the same year, thousands of miles apart, with no way of ever comparing notes. Something had gone wrong with the sky itself, and nobody alive had any idea why. Somewhere, historians still argue exactly where, Iceland is the leading suspect, a volcano erupted with enough force to punch ash and sulfur straight into the upper atmosphere, high enough that wind currents smeared it across the entire northern hemisphere like a bruise. You don't know any of this, of course. You just know the sun looks wrong, the air is colder than it should be, and it's the middle of summer. Because that's the part that breaks people. It's June, and it's snowing. Tree rings from Ireland to Siberia to California all record the same thing. 536 was the coldest single year in over 2,000 years. Summer temperatures drop by as much as 4 degrees Celsius, about 7 degrees Fahrenheit, across the hemisphere. That sounds small on paper. In a field, it's the difference between a harvest and nothing at all. Your crops don't just grow slowly, they don't grow at all. Wheat rots in cold, waterlogged soil before it ever ripens. Fruit trees flower late, then freeze. Whatever instinct told your ancestors when to plant, when to harvest, when to prepare, none of it applies anymore. The sky has stopped keeping its side of the bargain, and it isn't just crops. Bees stop leaving their hives in a cold that never breaks, so the little pollination that could have saved a late crop never happens either. Rivers that should be melting into a spring thaw stay half-frozen. Even the ocean seems to misbehave. Sailors of the period report strange, thick fog sitting on the water for weeks. Nothing about the natural world is behaving the way generations of memory said it should. You've stored grain for a bad season before. Everyone has. But a bad season, you can survive. Nobody prepared for a bad decade, because 536 isn't a one-year problem. The volcanic winter is followed within a few years by at least 2 more major eruptions, a brutal 1-2-3 punch that keeps the skies choked and the temperatures crashing for the better part of a decade. By the time the sky starts clearing, you've lived through failed harvest after failed harvest. Livestock die because there's nothing left to graze. Grain reserves that were supposed to last generations are gone in a single season, and the ones after it are worse. Chinese records from this exact period describe summer frost and yellow dust falling like snow. Middle Eastern chronicles describe failed Nile floods and famine spreading through Mesopotamia. Irish annals record what they call a failure of bread, a famine so severe it needed its own name in the historical record. The Roman statesman Cassiodorus, writing to officials in Italy, described a sun that had seemed to have lost its wonted light, and a moon with no natural warmth, his own words, written in real time by a man trying to make sense of a sky that no longer behaved. Desperation does what it always does. People strip bark from trees to grind into something resembling flour. Seed grain meant for next year's planting gets eaten instead, because there might not be a next year to plan for. Entire communities pack up and migrate south, toward warmer latitudes that seem to be faring slightly better, only to arrive and find the same failed fields, the same hollow-eyed neighbors, and no surplus to share with strangers. You are not having a uniquely bad year. Every human being on the planet, in every civilization that kept written records, is having the same catastrophic year, at the same time, for entirely different, unrelated reasons that nobody alive can connect. Here's the part that turns a bad decade into a nightmare. A weakened, starving, migrating population, desperate, on the move, immune systems already collapsing from years of malnutrition, is exactly the condition a pandemic needs to spread. In 541, just a few years after the skies finally start to clear, the plague of Justinian arrives. It's the same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death 800 years later, and it rips through a population already broken by a decade of famine and cold. It moves along the same trade routes and grain ships that were supposed to be carrying relief. A port city takes delivery of a grain shipment meant to ease the famine, and within it rides something far worse than hunger. Within weeks, that port city is burying more people a day than it once did in a month. Estimates vary, but some historians believe this single outbreak killed as much as a third to half of the population in the regions it hit hardest. Constantinople alone is said to have lost thousands of people a day at the outbreak's peak, so many that the city reportedly ran out of ground to bury them in, and bodies were stacked in towers along the city walls or loaded onto ships and sent out to sea. Combined with the famine years before it, some regions may have lost the majority of their people within a single generation, a demographic wound that would take over a century to close. You didn't just live through the worst weather in 2,000 years. You lived through the famine it caused, and then the plague that famine helped unleash, back to back, with no time to recover between them. Historians studying this period call it the beginning of the late antique Little Ice Age, and some argue it didn't just make life miserable. It rewrote the map, weakened empires, collapsed trade routes, political power vacuums that reshaped Europe and the Middle East for the century that followed. Some historians even trace the eventual decline of the Eastern Roman Empire's golden age back to this single decade, an empire that just a few years earlier had been at the height of its wealth and expansion, only to spend the rest of the century recovering from a disaster it never saw coming and never understood. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. For over 1,000 years, nobody knew why 536 happened. No volcanic eruption was recorded in the history books available to later scholars, just the accounts of people describing a sky that stopped working with no explanation attached. For centuries, later generations assumed the chroniclers had simply exaggerated, the way old accounts of disasters so often seem to. It took ice cores drilled out of Greenland and Antarctica in the 21st century, thin layers of volcanic sulfur trapped in ancient ice, one for each year like tree rings, for scientists to finally prove what caused it. Modern researchers matched the sulfur spike to the year 536 almost perfectly, and found evidence of at least two more major eruptions stacked on top of it within the following decade, confirming over 1,400 years later that the people who lived through it hadn't exaggerated anything at all. The people living through it never got that explanation. They just had to survive a decade that made no sense, with a sun that didn't work right, and no way of knowing if it would ever end. You've had bad years. We all have. But somewhere out there, an entire generation lived through 18 months without a real summer, a famine that lasted the better part of a decade, and a plague that finished off whoever the famine didn't, and they did it with absolutely no idea what was happening to them or when it would stop. No news reports, no scientists to explain the ash in the sky, just the sun looking wrong year after year, and a quiet growing fear that it might never look right again. Next time your year feels like the worst one yet, remember? The actual worst year in recorded history didn't even come with an explanation. It just came and stayed for the better part of a decade and left the survivors to rebuild a world they no longer recognized. If you want the next one, the disease outbreak so brutal doctors treated it by making things worse, hit subscribe because that one's already loading